Hello, welcome back to the Snipe Museum of Art. My name is Joe Becherer and I'm honored to serve as your museum director. Well, we're not actually in the museum right now. We're outside on a lovely summer day in the Charles B. Hayes Family Sculpture Park, which is in fact a very important extension of the museum itself. The sculpture park is an important and recent addition to the museum environment. We already had the courtyard space adjacent to the museum, but this is a completely different kind of experience. Standing just behind me is one of the icons of the sculpture park, Fern Temple 4, by Father Austin Collins. We'll talk a little bit further about Father Collins' piece and the significance of it here in the sculpture park in a little bit. But first, let me say a few things about the notion of a sculpture park and just how significant this gift from the Hayes family really is to this entire region. Let me step out of the way. Unlike a museum environment, in particular a gallery space where temperature and light are firmly controlled, a sculpture park is responsible to be in communication and responsive to nature. Light changes, temperature changes, weather changes, not just the green spaces, but the works that are housed within as well. Sculpture parks, sculpture gardens have become extremely important and popular in recent decades. However, their history is quite old. We can go back to the classical world, some people even argue back to the Egyptian world, and think about sculpture being placed in the open air. How important it is, how strong it can be, what kind of statements can be made when things are seen in the midst of open skies with lots of natural light. Sculpture in the open air, artwork in the out of doors, is an important addition to any museum collection. The 9.5 acres of the Charles B. Hayes Family Sculpture Park has a very interesting history. Located here on the edge of the University of Notre Dame campus, it was once a site where ash was dumped. That idea of taking something that was considerably disregarded and on the outskirts of campus and making it central to campus and a connector to the community was really a concept of former director Charles Loving. And in many ways, this park is his vision come to life. One of the things about a sculpture park is that most tend to be very neat, very manicured, highly clipped and edged green spaces. In some ways, you could think about the Irish Green, which is directly across the street, where there are mowed lawns, where there are clipped bushes, where the trees have been very carefully tended. However, for this sculpture park, the museum turned to the work of Michael van Valkenburg, an esteemed landscape architect, whose aesthetic was very different. In this park, Van Valkenburg decided to return to nature, to look at a space that, with native plantings like trees and grasses and shrubs, would help to bring back a space long before even the University of Notre Dame was here. In fact, in general, the aesthetic is to try to recreate a natural northern Indiana environment that would have been familiar to Father Soren when he first arrived in this location. Therefore, native grasses, native wildflowers, native trees and plants are central to the aesthetic of this particular sculpture park. Taken further, we also have to look at Michael van Valkenburg's aesthetic. Unlike, for example, the Irish Green, where things are planted very rhythmically, perhaps they're even arranged in a kind of geometric fashion that favors symmetry and measurement. There is something decidedly organic in the way that paths wind and green plants respond to them in Van Valkenburg's design. Also note that he plants in broad swaths, so it's not just one or two grasses or bushes, it's many, and together they begin to create a kind of visual flow that leads you from one location to the next. This is also an extremely important environment in terms of understanding how water is used and how infrequently any kind of herbicides, pesticides need to be used. In fact, because native plants are primary in this space, it is a very earth-friendly environment, and we're quite proud of that. In overview, as you come through this space, it is a site that needs to be experienced. You are, in a sense, walking through a work of art in and of itself as you travel the paths. Think about how the green spaces work. Notice how the trees and shrubs establish vistas. Think about how various plants and openings among them serve as a kind of framework system that allows you to appreciate some of the sculpture even more so. Yes, it is a sculpture park, and yes, there is a long tradition for having sculpture parks here in the United States, coming out of Europe, but with a history that goes back to the ancient world as having sculpture in the out of doors. Every time I'm here, I think of the British sculptor Henry Moore's statement that he'd rather have his sculptures in the open air than any place else. Why did he say that? Well, let's turn our attention back to Father Austin Collins' Fern Temple 4. It's a wonderful totemic piece. It towers and it serves as a kind of guide as you walk across, especially the northern edge of the sculpture park. Look at how it works in the green space of the trees around it. Look at how it seems to emerge from the grasses below it. Take into consideration how light is falling across the surfaces, especially on this beautiful sunny morning. Look at how shadows are cast and how those shadows, if you can in your imagination, will change over the course of the day. This work has a life, this work has a vibrancy outside in the natural world here in this Hayes Sculpture Park that it wouldn't necessarily have contained in a museum interior. I also think that this is an important icon because it helps us to think about the relationship that sculptors in particular have with the natural world. In Collins' piece, there are decided industrial elements. You can sense the steel. In certain passages, you can see his weld work. You can see the geometry of the cuts that speak of industry, that speak about metal being used for the purposes of industry. But then there are these leafy fern elements. Their organic contours, their laciness, serves as a dynamic contrast to the more industrial parts of the sculpture. That relationship between the human-made and the natural is inherent to Collins' piece. And if we think about it in the largest sense, it really helps us to consider the sculpture park in general. What is the relationship between the human-made and the natural? How does one respond to the other? How does one react to the other? How does one remind us of the importance of the other? In general, the overall aesthetic of the Charles B. Hayes Family Sculpture Park is one where we consider works by human hands in an environment that, yes, was ultimately crafted by human design through Michael van Valkenburg's aesthetic, but relies heavily on the natural world and the kind of experiences Father Soren would have had coming to this site when it was new territory to a European. It pays homage to plants, to trees, to shrubs, to waterways, to wetlands that celebrate this region in an artful way. One final note, it's important to remember, Father Austin Collins gave this iconic sculpture to the park in honor of Charles Loving, my predecessor, the former director of the museum. An appropriate testimony to one person's vision and the importance of having such a wonderful, ever-changing, seasonally beautiful environment that we cherish as a part of our museum family. Hope you can come out any time of day, experience the spots, appreciate the overall environment, walk the paths, and celebrate sculpture, the natural environment, and, of course, the Hayes family. Thank you very much. Hope to see you in the park.